Hello guys, how you doing and welcome to a new game. This game is played between judit polger and Garry Kasparov. Since you all loved the previous video of Garry Kasparov defeating judit polger, this is a new video between the two legends, but the result is a little bit different or completely different. This match is played between Russia against the rest of the world. Judith Bulgar is playing with white pieces and she opens the game as she always does with 1 e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. The Royal Lopez is on the board. Knight to f6, Gary goes for the Berlin defense. And like a godmother says, whoever lost the game playing the Berlin. Well, see Judith crushing the Berlin. So here Judith just castled. It's all standard theory. Gary takes the pawn and d4, knight to d6, and bishop takes c3. Gary, of course, here this knight is protecting this pawn, so Gary, of course, sorry, Judith will eliminate the knight first and then grab her pawn back. C takes and d takes e5, and knight to f5. Queen takes d8. Queen takes d8, an early queen trade. King takes d8 and knight to c3. If you look at this position, you will see that Judith castled her king to safety, developed almost all her minor pieces except for this bishop. When she develops this bishop, she will connect her rooks. And when you look at Gary's position, Gary hasn't developed most of his minor pieces. His king is white in the open in the center of the board. So Judith is to be preferred here. Gary goes for h6, taking this square from this knight and preventing this bishop to be developed in this amazing square with check. Sorry, with check. And now Judith gives a check. Rook d1 check. King to e8 by Gary, and h3 by Judith. Bishop to e7, and here bishop to e7 is not the best move. Of course, the best move here is the bishop to d7 and castle queenside, but Gary has a different approach. Here, bishop to e7 and knight to e2, the best move by recommended by the agent, played by Judith. Knight to h4. Gary wants to trade this knight, but because Gary's knight here doesn't have many squares. I mean, he doesn't have this square. He doesn't have this square. Sorry, he doesn't have this square. He doesn't have this square. So Gary played bishop to e7 to protect the square in order to trade the knights, which he does. Judith goes for it because it's the best move recommended by the engine. Knight takes h4, bishop takes h4, and bishop to e3. It's not the best move as well. The best move here is just to develop the knight to a more active square, or maybe bring the other rook into the game. But yeah, Judith knows what she's doing. Bishop to f5 and knight to d4. Bishop to h7. Bishop to h7 is not the best move, and it's actually a mistake by Gary. Here, bishop to d7 is the best move, and castle queenside is good. In order, of course, you cannot castle kingside after you play bishop to d7 because you have this annoying knight to f3 attacking this bishop, and also when the bishop is on d7, it will be attacked by the rook. So you will lose the game on the spot. So you'll have to play bishop to d7 and castle queenside, not kingside. Okay, bishop to h7, g4, best move recommended by the engine. Bishop to e7, king to g2, h5. Gary wants to open up the position, bring his rook into the game, get this open file for his rook, and hopefully like get some attacking chances because we all know that Gary is an attacker by nature. Here, knight to f8, king to f3, protecting this pawn because this knight was attacking this pawn. Bishop to g6, uh, bishop to g6, and rook to d2. Maybe Judith wants to double up on the d file. H takes g4 and h takes g4. rook to h3 check, and king to g2, attacking the rook. Rook back to h7, king to h3, f6, and bishop to f4. Bishop takes, pawn takes, f takes, and here Judith plays a fantastic move. She activates her rook with a tactic. Judith plays rook to e1. Here the pawn cannot take because it's pinned to the king because of the rook. So she activates her rook with a tactic. Very well played by Judith. Gary plays bishop to d6. Bishop takes pawn on e6 and king to d7. Gary, of course, here lost a pawn, so and he has a doubled c pawn, so he doesn't want to exchange more pieces because it will lead. In the end, he will be in a bad end game, and probably will lose the game. Here's c4, c5. Here, best was just to play b6. Was better than c5. See here, Gary. Like I said, Gary here played c5. Here, Judith takes the bishop. Bishop takes and c takes. Gary kind of fixed his pawn structure. If you remember, he had this doubled c pawn. Rook to e6. A nice rook left by Judith, and here Judith is attacking this pawn, and there is no way for Gary to defend this pawn. So he plays the best move by the engine just to activate his rooks and double up on the h file, the open file, the only open file on the board, the h file. And he plays rook h8, and rook takes d6 was check, and here king to c8, rook 2 to d5, ready to take this pawn was check. So Gary first gives a check, rook h3 check, king g2, rook h2 check, king f3, and rook 2 to h3 with check, king to e4, and b6 defending the pawn. Rook to c6 was check, king to b8, and now rook d7, rook h2. Here, king to e3, rook to f8. Gary wants to take this pawn. Okay, rook c7, rook takes f5, and rook b7 was check, king to c8, and rook to c7 was check, king to d8, and rook takes on g7. If you look at the position, Judith has a pass pawn on the king side, and now she will take this pawn on the queen side, and these pawns will fall, and she will have these pawns, and they will march forward and completely winning endgame for Jib Bulgar. Gary plays king to c8, and it was in this position that Gary Kasparov lost the game, and I prepared how it will end. Of course, he lost in this position. He lost. He played king to c8 and resigned the game. But here, maybe Judith will take the pawn and start to grab these pawns, gives a check, maybe trade a pair of rooks, and completely winning in game for Jib Bulgar.